Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's discussion and update on COVID-19 webinar. I am Kathy Purdy, a marketing manager here at Schoeneck King. Two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address those throughout today's presentation. Also, your comments and suggestions for future topics are important to our attorneys. Therefore, we would appreciate you taking a moment to complete a brief survey once today's webinar has ended. So to start things off, I'm going to hand it over to Pete Jones.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. We took a little inventory here just before we get started. We've been doing this webinar since March 3rd. This is week 38. And we've averaged just under 1,000 attendees per week. This is a challenging time. It's a strange time, and the world is changing around us. But we're happy to be here with you, and we're glad that folks are still joining us every Tuesday. We've got a lot to talk about again today, and we're going to start off with Katie Anderson. Katie is going to give us an update from Albany, which is really becoming an update from what's going on around the state. Katie, why don't you walk us through it?
Yep, I am happy to do so. We got a busy things to talk about today. First thing I want to talk about is this executive order came out last night. This is Executive Order 202.77. This allows people to, basically the Department of Health is going to establish guidelines about visitation, different guidelines for visitation leave at a nursing home, and how those nursing homes and adult care facilities absent to visit relatives or friends. That is going to be, we will be watching out for that. So let's move on to the real thing that's really become why this is a statewide update at this point. There are 26 clusters. I know there's only 18 on the screen. Don't worry, the next slide has more that are currently active in New York. Yesterday, we saw Monroe County and Onondaga County go to orange zones. I'm not going to be discussing the different restrictions right now about clusters. If you have questions about that, we're doing a webinar at 1 that you can join. That webinar, we're going to be going into depth about what the cluster restrictions mean for businesses and for schools. But one thing to know is any cluster that was determined yesterday, the restrictions go into effect for businesses tomorrow and for schools on Thursday, so Thanksgiving. And that will be a different, that's a change. But generally speaking, these cluster restrictions seem to go into effect 2 business days after. So it's really technically 1 business day between each, restriction, whenever the announcement's made, and then 2 business days. So 2 business days between for schools. That's been the general rule of thumb, but there is no firm, firm metric set for that. So again, we have 26 that are set, and this covers, it's a swath of the state. And in a different slide, I'll go over, this is my handmade slide I made this morning. Wanting to show you where the clusters are really located. So you have 3 large clusters in Western New York, the Finger Lakes, and Central New York, Onondaga County, Monroe County, Erie County. Those are large, they cover large geographic areas. And then you have, parts of the southern tier where you're still having issues. You still have an orange zone in Chemung County. And then you have really the Mid-Hudson and downstate region. Long Island had its first cluster zones designated yesterday. New York City, you have, I believe it's 6 active clusters currently in New York City, with Manhattan having Washington Heights just designated as a cluster yesterday. And then Westchester County, when you look at the positivity rates or infection rates even of the states next to New York, specifically Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Connecticut, their rates of infection are significantly higher. So you see on the border of these places why we're having clusters pop up. The effective times, again, this is just a helpful slide for you. It is really that 2 business days after the designation. So the day that it's designated, and then the next day, it tends to be 2 days after. 3 for schools. Once the designation's made, a locality can opt in sooner. Again, it goes into effect today, tomorrow, and Thursday for businesses and schools respectively. One thing that's been helpful since our update from last week, where I was, saying that we're in a bad place in a lot of these places, is that the governor has now started putting out warning tracks for different areas for what the cluster designation may be in the future. Currently, Buffalo and the surrounding towns are on the warning track to be a red zone. That is, obviously of concern. Westchester County, you have Yonkers, New Rochelle, Portchester, Tarrytown, Peekskill, Ossining. All of them are on track to either be an orange or red zone. Did not say specifically where that would fall, which towns would have a red zone, which towns would be orange, just said orange or red. Orange County, the 2 towns are on track to be orange, Newburgh and New Windsor. Putnam County, Brewster, yellow zone. And then Ontario County, you have Victor with a yellow zone as well. These have not been announced yet, but keep your eyes out for them. And obviously, we will also be keeping our eyes out for them. And that brings, I believe that's the end of my part. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everybody. And again, if you do, we're going to go into more specifics about the clusters in an hour. So feel free to join us at 1 to do that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate that. We, in light of this, and in light of what I think has been predicted and now is unfortunately coming to fruition, that there will be increases in incidents of the virus with the fall and winter weather, with people going indoors. We thought it would be useful to spend a few minutes preparing or talking about being prepared for a slowdown, scale back, or a shutdown of operations. So Sanjeev D'Souza in our Albany office is going to offer a few thoughts on that.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks everyone for joining us again. So to jump on Pete's comment, if we head back into shutdowns, restrictions similar to anything that we experienced earlier in the year, much of it is going to obviously be driven by governor's orders and other directives coming from the states and the Fed. So one thing that we'll need to keep careful attention on is what those restrictions are, how they're laid out, and how they affect each of you as an employer. I want to just touch on a few considerations, if we do get back to that point and employers do need to scale back on-site operations or what have you. So let me take this in order. The first thing I wanted to touch on is just reductions in force if we get to that point and you need to do that. So much of this is going to be review of things that we've covered in prior webinars. In terms of RIFs, there's a number of different ways that they can play out. So one option would be a voluntary RIF, and that's where an employer would offer an exit incentive essentially to an employee pool, and in the hopes of drawing enough folks in, they can reduce their employee tally, get to a point that they can manage financially, and in exchange for that voluntary separation, which would typically include a severance benefit of some sort, they would obtain a separation agreement with the release of claims. and those separation agreements, if that's something that you're looking at as an employer, there are a number of considerations here. One is, what type of benefit would you offer? Is it, financially feasible? If you are offering it, who are you offering it to? What are the eligibility criteria? Is there, is it years of service? Is there an age component to it? There are a lot of considerations that go into that. And, if you're looking at something like that, you'd certainly want to discuss with counsel. If you do use these types of separation agreements, one of the things you'll certainly want to have is a valid release of claims. And that's where your separation agreement needs to have the bells and whistles, including Older Worker Benefit Protection Act disclosures, the minimum time period to review, revocation period, and then there are certain disclosures about who is eligible for this offer and who is not, identified by age and title. So that's something to keep in mind if you're looking at a voluntary RIF. If that's not something that an employer is looking at, but they do need to downsize, then it usually turns to a question of, is this going to be a furlough? Or is this going to be a layoff? And if you're really, the distinction is one that doesn't really come out of the law so much as just the terms that employers have gotten used to using. So furlough is typically used for something that's considered a temporary reduction in your workforce with the expectation that you would bring those folks back at some point, versus a layoff, which is typically understood to be something permanent. So in either case, though, if you're selecting the employees that would be subject to either the furlough or the layoff, that selection is very important. So just as a general matter, right, the best practice is to be able to select folks using some sort of objective criteria that you can defend if need be later on. So it might be something like productivity, or it may be seniority, for example. And when we advise our clients, we try to steer away from the more subjective elements that really are not quantifiable or explainable. So if you're looking at terms like, is the person a team player, or are they adaptable, or are they coachable? Can they think outside the box? Those are the kinds of criteria that make us nervous as counsel, and we prefer that for your best interest that you don't use those types of criteria. But anyway, certainly, the selection criteria is important. Then you have, you need to think about folks who might be on leave at the time that you're looking at this reduction. Are those folks, can you include them if need be in the reduction? What are the risks to you there? If somebody's on FMLA, for example, when you're looking at a reduction, are they protected from the reduction? The FMLA regs themselves say that an employee is not shielded from the types of decisions that would have affected them had they not taken the leave in the first instance. So if you're using objective criteria to select employees for layoff, let's say it's seniority, and you have an employee on FMLA that's out, you may still be able to include them in the layoff because of the criteria you're using. They would have been subject to layoff even if they hadn't taken the leave. But the employees on leave is one of the considerations that you need to pay attention to when you're looking at a potential reduction. In addition to that, you've got to give thought to what types of payments might be due to employees if you're furloughing them or laying them off. So one example is final pay, applicable typically in the layoff situation where it's a permanent separation. So depending on where you are, if you're in New York or another state, you got to be mindful of the laws that apply there. So New York, for example, requires that final paycheck be cut and provided for the payday associated with the final pay period that the employee worked in. If the employee asks for it to be mailed to them, they have a right to get it that way. So that's one consideration. You want to look at your paid time off policies and make sure you've covered what types of payments, if any, are due to an employee when they're separated. Does it apply in an involuntary separation case? And then, just make sure you've looked at your policies to ensure that you don't have somewhere in a handbook or a standalone policy some sort of severance policy that you need to be mindful of in the case of reductions. And then on top of that, depending on the size of the reduction, you got to be mindful of WARN. So that's the notice that's required in the case of mass layoffs or shutdowns. And so, we have federal WARN, but in New York, we also have a state-specific WARN. And that one is actually more stringent than the federal WARN. So it applies to employers of smaller sizes. It requires greater notice before the reduction if certain thresholds are met. So for example, in the case of a mass layoff, it's an employment loss that at a single site that affects at least 33% of the workforce and covers at least 25 full-time employees. Or if that's not met, the reduction covers at least 250 employees. And that reduction is expected to last at least 6 months. So, there may be WARN implications to the reduction. Even in a furlough case where you may be reducing people temporarily with the expectation that you bring them back, WARN still could apply if those layoffs end up being longer, or the furloughs end up being longer than 6 months. In which case you may not have thought they would have lasted 6 months at the outset, but at some point you may realize you're coming up on that 6-month point, and you may need to provide the notice. Now, one important additional consideration here is an exception under New York WARN, which applies to unforeseen business circumstances, which might excuse the failure to give that full 90-day notice period. And that applies in cases where there's a sudden economic downturn that couldn't have been anticipated, or there's a government shutdown that was imposed. And, again, it's very fact specific, but certainly, for many employers, the impact of COVID back in the spring and the impact it had on business and in some cases shutdowns was certainly something that nobody could have foreseen at the time. And it certainly, it was possible that would fit the exemption. But WARN is also something to think about. So that's a few things I want to just mention real quick about reductions in force. Let me touch briefly on something short of that, which would be reductions in hours. So there you want to differentiate between your exempt employees versus your non-exempt in thinking through this. For your exempt folks, the ordinary rule, right, is that they're entitled to their full salary for any week in which they work. So you're going to, think about situations where you might be shutting down for an entire week versus 1 or 2 day shutdowns per week. In those circumstances, for your exempt employees, what's the appropriate way to handle it? Is it appropriate to now reduce the employee's salary going forward, proportionate to now the work schedule? If the anticipation is you're going to be working a reduced schedule for the next several months. But you have to be, again, mindful of that, because changes back and forth to an exempt employee's salary week to week can have an impact on their exempt status. Now, if we're talking about hourly employees, then the question is, are we just reducing the number of hours that the employee is working versus reducing the pay rate? If you're reducing the pay rate, then you have to comply in New York with the Wage Theft Protection Act, which requires 7 days advance notice before you make that reduction. So a couple of thoughts on that. Then in addition to that, if you are reducing employees' hours, consider whether you can do it through the shared work program that unemployment offers, where you would do essentially an equivalent reduction for employees, anywhere between 20 to 60% of their normal hours, and then they can apply for a partial unemployment benefit. There are steps that you have to follow in order to be able to apply for that and participate in the program. One of them generally requires that you keep their benefits at the same level, even if you're reducing the hours. But there needs to be essentially sort of an equality between the employees in that unit that you've identified in terms of the hours reduction they're experiencing and the pay reduction that follows with it. And then as a general matter, again, for if you're reducing employees or laying off, pay attention to other furlough rather than layoff. Pay attention to your benefit plans if you're trying to keep them on some of those plans during the furlough or during the reduced hour period. The last thing I want to mention is for those unionized employers, be mindful of your CBAs, because if you are looking at a reduction in hours or a layoff, look at your contracts. What does the contract say about layoff? What does your management rights clause allow you to do? What payouts might you be required to make in the case of a layoff? And then are there alternatives to a layoff that the contract permits you to do to reduce expenses or reduce headcount even temporarily? Also look to see if your contract has a force majeure clause that might give you the ability to take certain steps unilaterally because of the emergency situation. And then additionally, you have to consider, do you have an obligation to bargain over any of the changes that you're looking to make in a reduction, in a scale back, or in a shutdown? So I've covered a lot. Hopefully that touches on some useful points for you to consider going forward. If you have questions on these types of issues, certainly you can reach out to any of us on this call and to the bond attorney that you regularly work with. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Pete.
Sanjeev, a couple of quick questions here in the Q&A. The first one is, if the governor shuts us down, are there some exceptions, or do we have to give the full WARN Act notice? I think the answer to that is no. There are some exceptions in there, but we want to, give as much notice as we can. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Pete, on that. I think if it's a government-ordered shutdown, the WARN reg actually specifically identifies that as one of those types of circumstances. It's considered an unforeseen circumstance. But you're also right that the employer's obligation continues to be you provide as much notice as reasonably possible under the circumstance.
And the other question, and this one may be one that we're going to have to deal with more if we continue to move in certain clusters to, full shutdown, or, and that is, what does it mean to be an essential business? And if I was essential in April, am I still essential now? I guess my thought on that is yes, that you likely are, that you would need to check the updated Empire State Development Corporation website. And also, I think there are some principles embedded there, which include, if you can work remotely, you must in the event of a full shutdown. And a lot of times there's parsing of whether the entire business is essential, or if it's a business that supports essential business, there may be some parts of the business that receive that designation. So I think our thought would be, if you're going to, if you're faced with that issue, you'll need to check the most recent guidance and do the analysis again.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the first step, is to see, do you fit clearly within the guidance and the ESDC's list of essential businesses, and if not, is there a way to try to get added to it in some way? Is there that option? But certainly something that I think that you got to work through carefully with counsel, because the failure to comply can be expensive and through fees and fines, etc.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, let's turn to Hillary Marrera. Hillary's in our Garden City office, and we thought it would be useful, again, sort of looking forward and looking backward kind of thing. Discipline and discharge. We've got some sort of repeat COVID issues that come up, things that people do or don't do, and then some reminders about sort of run-of-the-mill discipline as well.
Thanks, Pete. A large part of my practice pre-COVID had to do with advising clients on employees who are doing bad things. And even during COVID, employees are still doing bad things, but we are seeing a lot of other issues coming up surrounding the health and safety. And a lot of the disciplinary action is being taken are related to instances that pre-COVID probably maybe would have had just a simple warning. So I want to give you some examples of some health and safety issues that we've had with some employees, give you a little bit of advice. But just note, anything related to health and safety, what we're finding are in the context of where there are unions. Even the unions are behind our employers in terms of disciplining employees who may be putting their fellow union members at risk. So for example, we had an issue with an employee who improperly filled out the screening questionnaire. They had symptoms of COVID, went to go get tested, and yet filled out the questionnaire that he did not, came to work, and lo and behold, 2 days later, when he got the test, he was positive. So he ended up exposing a lot of employees, one in particular who was pregnant at the time, to potential COVID because he was positive. Now, one thing that I will just say is that on that particular screening is that at the end, all employees have to check that they certify the answers to the screening test were true and accurate. So not only did we have him on the safety issue of, coming to work when he was experiencing symptoms of COVID, but also now that he lied on the screening form. So to the extent your form just simply asks the required questions about whether or not you're experiencing symptoms of COVID, if you've traveled to certain places, those types of questions, make sure the last question is that they have to check that they have certified that everything that they have answered is true and accurate. It will give you an additional charge to the extent that somebody does lie and we find out about it. We had another case where an employee who was considered to be a close contact of somebody who did test positive for COVID-19, got into an argument with his supervisor and actually threatened him and said, once I test positive for COVID, I'm coming back to the work and I'm going to breathe on you. So obviously this is a threat these days, and that created a lot of angst in the workplace. There was already a yelling match between the employee and the supervisor as it was, and we did consider that a threat. The union actually considered that a threat. The employee was not a stellar employee otherwise, so we did go to a hearing on that, and he was actually terminated for that and other reasons. But clearly something like that pre-COVID, nobody would have thought twice about that. Another instance I just got a call about related to custodians, who we all know custodians these days are very essential employees. They're the ones that sanitize the building after somebody tests positive, make sure everything is safe and healthy for employees and members of the public or our clients to come into work each day. And I had one custodian who was a night custodian angry at another custodian and decided to spit in the other custodian's disinfectant bottle, who then that custodian was going to use that bottle to then clean, the offices. And so obviously, there could be an argument made that the spit would have been disinfected by the disinfectant in the bottle, but still the union actually was very upset and irate about that instance, because not only are these essential employees that need to be at work and disinfecting the offices and making sure everything is safe and healthy, but they also put at risk the other custodians that they come into contact with. So we are certainly seeing these health and safety issues increase, and that seems to be a lot where the discipline is coming about, obviously more so than what was in pre-COVID. The other thing, there are two other areas that we're seeing a number of disciplinary cases, and one kind of goes off of what Sanjeev was just talking about in terms of, if you have a slowdown and some people are going to be working from home, what we're finding is that employees working from home, they're not as productive as they are when they're working from the office. And And the discipline that we've been seeing is that sometimes with your hourly employees, they're saying that they're working a full day and completing timesheets saying that they've worked a full day, when actuality, they're taking their kids to and from school during their work time. They're not doing any work, and they're simply falsifying timesheets. So if you're going to have a large number of people working from home, make sure we have the ability to monitor what they're doing. And if people are submitting timesheets, that they're accurate. You shouldn't be submitting a timesheet that says you've been working the whole day when in fact you haven't. So we've been seeing an uptick of the falsification of documents in that sense. And then the last area that I'm sure you've all experienced that we're seeing is, people not wanting to comply with an employer's COVID policies and procedures. The question that I'm getting asked a lot about these days has to do with school districts in the yellow zone. And obviously you probably heard, in the yellow zone, 20% of your staff has to be tested within a 2-week period. And the question is, can we direct our staff to get tested, and can they refuse? And I always say, at this point, we are advising clients that give them a lawful directive, and if they refuse, it's considered to be insubordination. They do not have the right to say no. That's the same with, your policies of wearing a mask. If you have an employee who doesn't want to wear a mask, that would be considered insubordination, and based, of course, on the facts and circumstances, will delineate what type of discipline or discharge may be necessary. Remember, though, to the extent you have a collective bargaining agreement, or in the public sector, you have to comply with various due process, Section 75 or 3020A, or any just cause procedure in a collective bargaining agreement. Before you take any disciplinary action, make sure you are consulting those documents to make sure you provide the necessary due process. But all in all, look, I hope you all feel better that employees are still doing bad things everywhere. It's not just your employees, because I'm sure some of your employees are not following the rules. But I am relieved to report that the unions, where we do have unionized workforces, where it becomes a health and safety issue, they have not been fighting as much and have been more supportive of the discipline, and have been more willing to negotiate resignations or discharges or fines and suspensions when it really comes to the health and safety. So that's been at least a welcome change. And with that, Pete, I'll send it back to you.
Hillary, thanks. We got a few questions. People want to know what happened in these various cases that you cite, but let me say, what happened, it probably doesn't matter as much as how, your workplace operates. You've hit on the factors, I think, whether or not you've got a unionized setting, what your rules are, what the employee's history is, the extent to which these violations implicate safety, and if so, how egregious it is. I mean, with any disciplinary situation, there's a lot of considerations. And so I don't know that it really matters what you did in your cases, as much as it matters what the facts are, in the individual cases confronting each employer.
Yeah, I would agree, Pete. And it really depends on, so for instance, the person working from home that we had, if it's a non-exempt employee and they're submitting timesheets that are inaccurate, now being paid for work that they did not perform, well, I consider that to be falsification of timesheets, which I always would think is a terminable offense. But it really depends on the facts and circumstance of the case. And as Pete said, the history of your employer. So, look at your past practice. If a similar circumstance has occurred in the past and you haven't terminated, then we need to make sure that we're consistent in all areas. With the new health and safety things, like I was saying before about the COVID related things. So somebody, spitting in a disinfectant bottle pre-COVID may not have warranted, and in fact, probably wouldn't have warranted terminated. We would have told them, stop horsing around. You got to do your job, dump it out, get a new one, and all is right with the world, maybe a letter of reprimand or some type of short suspension, something like that. But in this day and age where health and safety is paramount, and any type of appearance of impropriety in the health and safety can not only be a PR nightmare for all employers, but the employees themselves feel unsafe. And so although in the past for health and safety things that are a little more run of the mill, it may not have been so severe because of, you of course need to take into account the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. In those instances, the discipline may be more severe just because of that.
Good summary. Okay, let's turn now to Andy Bobreck. Andy is in our Syracuse office, and he had some observations, and I think Andy, we're even going to do a standalone webinar on this, but some things to keep our eye on that are not necessarily COVID related as we end the year and move to next year.
Thanks, Pete. Good to be with you. Good to be with everyone here today. Yes, I was just giving some thought to this this week. So much that we're dealing with right now in terms of COVID and COVID-related personnel issues, and just didn't want things to slip through the crack necessarily, or at least to put these things on your so-called non-COVID to-do list here as we face year's end and moving into the next year too. So without ado, this list is not exhaustive, but I think these are some key things for employers here in New York to keep in mind. Of course, I don't think we can have too many webinars these days without mentioning paid sick leave out there. I know that's high on your list among those attendees here. I think the things to think about there are, one, the policy, what revisions we need to potentially make to our current leave policies. How do we fill in any gaps? If we have a labor contract with a union in place, how do we deal with that? If we're heading into negotiations, how do we deal with this issue there? These are the types of things that I'm working on a very regular basis with our clients. Likewise, I think there's a communication piece to this too. How are we going to explain any changes to our employees? And I think equally important, our supervisors. Those are the people who are going to field the questions. They're the front lines. They need to be informed and advised about any changes and provided with the information and facts they need to be able to respond to those employee inquiries. So again, I'd put that at or near the top of your list here because January 1st will be here before we know it. Second, we've had a statute on the books for some time now requiring all employers in New York to conduct sexual harassment training across the board for all employees. And again, I didn't want employers to lose sight of this. That's wasn't a one-time requirement. It's an annual requirement. And you may be up against a deadline here, either because of the way you've scheduled your year, which again doesn't necessarily have to be a calendar year, but it does need to be provided on an annual basis. For example, it could be a fiscal year or an academic year. But if you haven't done it yet in 2020, you indeed will be up against a deadline here to have this training completed among your workforce. Adding to that is the complexity, of course, of having perhaps remote work being conducted by some or a majority of your workforce. Also keep in mind that you need to provide your employees who receive this training with a copy of your sexual harassment policy. That policy needs to contain specific terms and conditions that are set forth by statute and are informed by guidance that the state has put out. We've certainly worked with a number of clients going back years now on those policies, as well as to implement the training. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, Pete, put a plug in for our own online harassment training module that we have in place. It's been a great success here. We've got many clients who've taken advantage of that. And I think especially now where we do have so many employees who are working remotely at our clients, that technology can really pay dividends and allow you to get this training completed and to have that training documented in a very short and timely and cost-effective manner. There's also, Pete, a number of changes with respect to payroll records. Some of these relate to the paid sick leave requirements. And I should back up too. For those first 2 points that I mentioned, the paid sick leave as well as the harassment training, Certainly there's state legislation that applies, but there's also New York City legislation that imposes requirements, both for the paid sick leave, which now under the New York City amendments pretty closely mirrors what's required in New York State, as well as a requirement for New York City employers to provide harassment training. I mention this distinction because there are some differing requirements between New York State employers and New York City employers with respect to these payroll records and the provision of paid sick leave. For New York State employers, generally, you do have to provide, at least you do need to keep and maintain payroll records that indicate on a weekly basis how much paid sick leave time an employee has used and accrued to that point. Again, payroll records that need to be kept on a weekly basis. Now, these do not need to necessarily be furnished to employees on a weekly basis, and under the New York State legislation, there's no requirement that this information be included in a pay stub. That differs from New York City law, as I'll mention in a minute. But again, you're going to need to make sure you're keeping these weekly payroll records that show the amount of time that's used and accrued under the New York State legislation. Under the New York City legislation, there's a different set of requirements, including a notification requirement to employees that recently went into effect and needed to be complied with. And there is a pay stub requirement. Specifically, the pay stub must contain the amount of sick time or safe time due under the New York City legislation, the time that's used or accrued, and the total amount accrued by an employee. That needs to be provided on the employee's pay stub. Now, that particular requirement was set to go into effect, I believe, on September 30th. There is guidance from New York City officials that has delayed implementation of this specific requirement until the end of this month. But employers, if they're going to avail themselves of that exception, they need to keep in mind that they have to demonstrate that they're making a good faith effort at compliance. Now, I recognize for many large employers, especially if you're doing your payroll in-house, oftentimes we're dealing with legacy software that is difficult to program and is not very nimble at all. So if you haven't already, I recommend you begin working on this issue very quickly to address this, because it could take some time. Pete, I don't want to go into too much on the WARN Act. I mention it here just because, unfortunately, with the economic changes afoot and the difficulties that we as a community face, it could be that reductions, temporary or otherwise, could be in the future. Sanjeev did a great job covering these issues, I think, in more detail. I just wanted to mention it. One, there's been a change in terms of a legislative change in New York in terms of who specifically needs to be provided with a copy of the notice that you give to workers. So, point being, don't rely on those old notices or a sample that you found perhaps on the internet that may well be outdated and not compliant. Make sure you work with legal counsel. And for me, I recommend it anytime you're talking about a layoff, temporary, otherwise, of a group of employees, it's really worth 10 minutes of your time to check with your bond attorney just to make sure you've got your T's crossed and your I's dotted. And if there is a WARN issue, or otherwise to confirm that there is no WARN issue. Again, I think this can be overlooked from time to time, but it's worth your while to work with your bond attorney. Pete, also commission agreements. At the end of the year, often we see changes to terms and conditions of workers who are paid in whole or in part by commission. So remember, those terms and conditions need to be put in writing for any employee who is compensated in commission in whole or in part. If you haven't dusted that one off in a while, now's a good time to take a look at that. And oftentimes I see changes do take place at the start of the year. And again, if you haven't updated that recently, I encourage you to do so. And certainly if you're going to make any changes to your incentive or commission compensation program, you're going to want to make sure that those are reflected in in the agreement that you have, the written agreement you have with your employees. Additionally, there's other handbooks, policy revisions, forms that you want to make sure you have up to date. With respect to handbooks and EEO policies and terms, keep in mind that there are some relatively new protected characteristics under New York state law. That would include characteristics that are historically associated with race. That would also include reproductive health decision-making as a protected status under New York. So you want to make sure your policies ideally have that information reflected in them. Additionally, sometimes I will see these policies missing reference to gender identity or expression, also protected statuses under New York law, and you want to make sure those are included. With respect to your form, keep in mind that New York now has a salary history ban in effect. So if your job application contains that information in it, in all likelihood, you will need to have that removed. And there are a number of other requirements that apply to trying to use or collect salary history information on prospective or current employees. So on the next slide, I think two key things we want to also talk about just briefly. The minimum wage in certain places in New York will go up effective at the end of this year, December 31st. It's done regionally now, as well as in New York City by employer size. We're not going to see changes in New York City. Those are in effect. They're already at the $15 level, but we will see raises in the Long Island and Westchester areas, as well as outside of New York. So again, you have the table there that's taken directly from the New York State Department of Labor's website, and I included a link there if you need to access it. Commensurate with an increase in the state minimum wage, you'll see on the next slide a discussion of the increase of the base salary pay levels required for exempt administrative and executive employees under New York state law. Again, this is set to increase in Long Island and Westchester, as well as in the remainder of New York State, keeping aside New York City. At the end of this year, again, that's the base salary that you need to pay an exempt worker who is either classified as executive or administrative to preserve their exempt status under New York state law. So they have to make that much, at least that much. Under New York state law, there's no minimum salary required for professional employees. But keep in mind, most professional employees are still subject to the base salary level under the separate Fair Labor Standards Act. And of course, you're going to want to ensure that that is met as well. So this could be a situation where come the end of the year, if you have an employee who is making less than this weekly amount currently and properly classified as exempt, come January 1, they may no longer be properly classified as exempt if their pay is not above this amount. So be sure to keep an eye on those. I would catalog those who you have working at or near this amount and classified as exempt, and to evaluate those situations. So finally, Pete, without too much further discussion, I want to mention what's ahead in 2021. Here's hoping. I think we're all on the same page that 21's a much better year than 20. That's certainly my wish for everyone who's attending here. I think we're in for more legislative action here in New York. The budget of late, that really seems to be the way that so much of the legislation is done these days. And so my eye is always on that, as I know are the eyes of my colleagues too. That typically happens in the springtime area. I saw yesterday that leadership in the New York State Senate has taken the position that they are and have been able to achieve a veto-proof supermajority in the state legislature, effectively meaning that the governor's office may not necessarily be a check on the moderation or reasonableness of legislation that comes out. And there are certainly some representatives who are looking to push a very aggressive legislative agenda. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. I talked with my colleagues, Chris Kurtz and Craig Olivo in our Garden City office. Both of them do a good amount of public sector work. They wanted and asked to just draw two things to any public sector employers' attentions we may have here on our webinar. One is that public sector employers need to have their pandemic operations plan finalized and set by the 21st of April this coming year, 2021. There's a whole set of procedures. We've got detailed guidance that we've put out on this. We're working with a number of public sector employers already. But if you're not, you should be working on this currently. And if not, begin to do so as soon as possible. There's a lot that needs to go into these plans. The definition of the public employers who are covered is very broad here. although it doesn't include school districts. School districts are going to be required to provide a comparable plan under a different set of the law here in New York, but keep that in mind. Also, there is a requirement that the draft plans be presented to unions to the extent you have unions who are impacted by this, union represented employees who are impacted by this new requirement. And I believe the deadline for conveying those draft policies to the unions that you may have in place is February 4th. Additionally, there is a requirement that municipal employers, really local governments who have a police force, that they need to provide a police reform plan and have that in place by this same deadline as it is, April 21st, 2021. Again, there's a lot that goes into these plans and a lot of requirements that need to be met. You can find more detailed information about this on our blog, the New York Labor and Employment Law Report. Pete, just trying to give some thought to some other things that I think we may see ahead in 2021. Taking my crystal ball out, and usually what my crystal ball entails is, looking at what maybe California has been doing, or looking what New York City has been doing, or some of the cities in those states have been doing. So, we've seen already a very significant expansion of the types of claims that can be brought by employees in New York, and really a lowering of the bar that's required in terms of proof for an employee to establish, in particular, a harassment claim here in New York. We're seeing more and more of those types of claims being asserted, and they're coming across our desks, I think, with greater frequency than perhaps we've seen in the past as a result of this lower bar. I think it's likely we could see additional measures put in place to lower that bar for other claims and to likewise enhance penalties that could be imposed. Again, the independent contractor relationship still is, still got a heartbeat here in New York, despite a lot of regulatory and legislative efforts to curtail the usage of independent contractors in New York. But the reality is, our government here in New York, our state government's looking at a $14.5 billion revenue shortfall from an article I read this morning. They're going to try to capture that revenue in many different ways, and the withholdings too. And of course, when there is independent contractor relationship that's bona fide, they don't get those withholdings. So I think we could see greater scrutiny of those. Again, perhaps an expansion of the prevailing wage law, covering additional types of projects or work that's being performed in New York in some way. I think we could see that. Pay-related disclosure requirements, similar to what's required of employers who are federal contractors, at least conceptually, as have been proposed. We could see something like that, where private sector employers here in New York are required to provide certain pay and employee demographic information to the state. And finally, I think restricted covenants and non-disclosure agreements, non-compete agreements in the private sector, I think those have been a target of regulators for some time, on the theory that they unfairly, in certain instances, infringe an employee from finding work. Again, I think that could be a target. And regardless, if you haven't taken a peek at your restricted covenant agreement in some time, I encourage you to do so and to work with your bond attorney on that. Pete, sorry, I ran a little over there. I apologize.
That's all right, Andy. A lot of good information, and I think it's important to keep this stuff on our radar. The grind of daily life, you can lose track of some of these things. I kind of like the notion of a non-COVID to-do list, to have it, out there so you can consult it periodically. But it's good to keep our eye on these things. I think next week we'll try and get the crystal ball out and do a little something on the federal side. And now that the presidential election is coming into focus here, I think we may have some observations there as well. So good to keep your eye on these things. Before we end today, I just wanted to take a minute, in the spirit of the season, to give our thanks. We know this has been a tough year. I think everybody's, in many ways ready to turn the calendar and hoping for a better 2021. But we here at Bond do still have a lot to be thankful for. We want to thank you for, for being with us here on the webinar and being with us as clients and friends. We want to thank you for putting your faith in us. We want to thank you for refusing to give in, for persevering in these really strange and difficult times. I've said this before, but I think it bears saying again. We are impressed with what our clients are doing, and you deserve a pat on the back for the work you're putting in, the results you're obtaining in these difficult times. So we'd like to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. We hope it's happy, healthy, and safe for everybody. And we'll see you back here next week.